My name's Rip Martin. I'm from Fort Worth, Texas. This is my theory, unified theory, and I've come to these conclusions and these findings over a number of years. I've known these things for quite a while, but I've been working on an engineering problem based on Newton's second law of motion. And during the course of those studies, I have figured some things out about generally the mechanisms that make the universe work. These are very fundamental. They're very important. There is a great deal of new advancements that we're going to be able to make based on these principles. One is the most profound, which is our ability to manipulate time. One of the things that I think that is really strong about my argument is that I have not complicated things. I have simplified. I think the only thing in the universe that makes small physics work is gravity, motion, and the characteristics of space-time. I think that's all there is. I think materials are made of matter, and matter is consistent. All matter is the same except for size. And size, in a combination of motion and space-time, gives you everything that we see in the universe today. So I'm going to start with Kepler's second law of planetary motion. It's the area law. Been around 1700s. I don't think anybody really has studied that very hard. I've spent the last 6 years studying that very question very closely and have come to some interesting conclusions about an error in those calculations. But that's where we're going to start, is Kepler's second law, area law. And what it states is that if you draw a line from the orbited body to the orbiting body and you subscribe time x for the orbiting body to travel and draw another line back to the orbited body, that area that sweeps out by that arc is the same for any time period in the elliptical orbit. So if you're to take a section out in the far side of the elliptical orbit, it will match the time period on the near side. And those areas will be even. That's wrong. Those areas have a definite difference in the long side and the short side of the ellipse. There is a force being exerted on the orbited body by the orbiting body. And that force is represented by the change in velocity from the far side of the ellipse to the close side of the ellipse. That time differential, that speed differential, represents work. And that work is going into the orbited body and accelerating it forward. Eventually, an elliptical orbit becomes circular. This is an extremely important concept. And this is the mechanism that can transfer motion across the vastness of space. I will continue and explain later. All of this material that I'm going to go over is abbreviated. I'm giving you the very big sweep in an hour, but it affects everything, and once you know it, you can't unknow it. To me, I can observe it everywhere. So, in the case of Pluto, we have a velocity max of 6.12 kilometers per second and a velocity minimum of 3.7 kilometers per second. That's a huge change over something that has a mass of 1.3 times 10 to the 22nd. Even though that's a long period, that is still a huge change in velocity over a huge mass. So that is a huge amount of work being done. And where is that work going? The work's going into accelerating the sun. So if we take just the force mass times acceleration equation to figure the force, we'd be taking a look at the delta V is actually 2 times that change, because you're decelerating on the way out and accelerating on the way back in. So the total change is 4.84 kilometers per second. So that force equation would be 1.3 times 10 to the 22nd times 4.84 kilometers per second divided by 247.4 years. So this gives us a force equation for Pluto exerting on the sun. So if we equate those, we get the formula that force is equal to the mass of Pluto times the acceleration of Pluto, which equals the mass of the sun times the acceleration of the sun. So the sun is 1.989 times 10 to the 30 kilograms. So there is a 8-digit difference. So obviously the acceleration in the sun would be very small, and the acceleration in Pluto could be reasonably large. But this formula is extremely important. This is easily verified. This is what I expect initially to be tested as to whether or not my theory is correct. But if you take a look at this and use this equation, you would have the mass of Pluto, acceleration of Pluto, mass of the sun, acceleration of the sun. Next orbit, you would take the mass of Pluto, the acceleration of Pluto last orbit, minus the acceleration you pull out of the sun, and that would give you the new mass of the sun times the acceleration of the sun second orbit. And this equation would deplete until you ended up with a circular orbit out of Pluto and a acceleration in the sun that made the two joint systems move off together. Thought experiment: if a planet-sized body comes into the sun and is captured with no collision, where does all that energy go? Well, it has to go into the elliptical orbit that is created by the planet-sized object and the sun, and that work and that energy has to be expended over time so that the system as a whole compensates for the velocity vector of the planet coming in. And the new velocity vector for the sun has to accommodate that energy and mass that has been brought into an elliptical orbit of the sun. This concept is extremely important. And as I go through the next mechanism, you should be able to see that this elliptical orbit is just a fundamental mechanism in how the universe works. Now, one thing to mention at this point is that if we look at the solar system the way it is now, it's pretty obvious to me that some of the planets were accreted and some of them were captured. And the reason that it's obvious is that the axis of spin of all the planets, none of them match. They don't match the way you would think the accretion would happen. And the sun doesn't match, its spin does not match the plane of the planets. Well, if you take a look at Pluto, you would have a force pulling the elliptical orbit out of the orbit of Pluto so it moves towards more circular. And the planets that are in the plane would also produce a force that would bring Pluto into the plane of the rest of the planets. I think this is the way planetary motion works. And I would say that just based on the spin of the planets, my argument makes much more sense than that somehow or another something hit Uranus and turned it on its side. Uranus was captured and had that spin originally when it was captured. The other one is that if elliptical orbits were stable, looks like to me all the orbits in the solar system and the moons would all be elliptical. So, all right, now let's take this and move it to an atomic scale. So, if you have an electron moving around a nucleus in an atom, if you induce an elliptical orbit in that electron, that makes the whole atom move. So, an elliptical orbit in an electron in an atom makes the whole atom move. Well, what do we call that? It's called heat. So one of the ways that you induce heat into a material is introducing elliptical orbits into the material, and then that elliptical orbit causes motion, which in turn causes vibration or bouncing in the material, which causes heat. So elliptical orbits are another way to produce, is the way that heat is produced from the outside of a material. It can be transferred by direct contact, or it could be transferred by some type of wave. Now, if we consider elliptical orbits, what might elliptical orbits also take care of? If they can produce a motion in the entire atom, isn't that what magnetism is? Magnetism is aligned atoms. We know that's a characteristic. And if you were to induce an elliptical orbit in those aligned atoms in one direction, you would get the whole magnetic material to move or to produce a force. And that force, because elliptical orbits can come in multiple directions, you can either have an attractive force or a repulsive force. So, aligned atoms with elliptical orbits produce a force, and that is the force that we see in magnetic materials. So this is just the simple overview of what a magnet is and what force and how that force is produced in a magnetic structure. So I spent a lot of time on my next question, and that is, what could be causing elliptical orbits? And how could that fit into our atomic observations and also our astronomical observations as to what we see in the data? Time waves. time waves are the mechanism that can transfer an elliptical orbit into something from the sun to, say, the skin on your arm on a sunny day. A time wave from the sun contacting the atoms in your skin cause the atoms to induce an elliptical orbit, which causes heat, and that heat is what you feel in your skin on a sunny day. And what else could transmit energy in a way that would produce motion from a million light years away? Except for time waves. So it's important to understand a couple of things about a time wave. Because a time wave only affects something moving in a timeless state, or very close to it. So a time wave hitting me doesn't do anything. But if I was moving at the speed of light, or the speed of time, then that time wave would have an absolute effect on me. Because I'm not experiencing time, then any change in the medium I'm traveling through, which is time, would have a big effect on me. It's part of the reason that the two-slit experiment stops working when the mass gets too big. It also has a fundamental effect on the way the math works with these things. It's very important for you to understand that an electron moving at the speed of time does not experience time. So there has to be an energy level associated, I would think, with going to time speed. Once you're there, if you're not experiencing time, there's no way that you naturally lose any motion. Once you're there, you're fixed until something completely drastic happens to you. This also means that it's important to realize that time is indifferent to mass. In other words, the reason you can't compress an atom is because fundamentally you're trying to compress time in a way that is a paradox. You can't short circuit the push that time has, no matter what the mass is. Motion is time and movement. So if you're controlling time, then you're controlling part of the movement. So once again, it seems kind of obvious to me now, but space is full of time and time is full of space. That is the ether. And the fact that it is time and that it is capable of transferring motion through the vastness of space just makes for the perfect answer. So let's think about what that would mean on an atomic scale. So you've got an electron traveling trillions of times a second around the nucleus of an atom, making time waves. Well, every circle it would encounter a time wave that it already made. So the reason that an atom is spherical and that the electron doesn't just follow a single circular path is because it's encountering its own time waves. So it produces a sphere, and it produces a no-time shell around the atom. And that no-time shell is generally impenetrable by mass because of the fundamental nature of electron to electron contact, and the fact that the two things that are coming in contact are in a timeless state, making time waves that inhibit motion. And that is part of the incompressibility and also the compressibility of different materials. It's because it's associated with the fact that a time wave works irrelevant of the mass behind it. It's working on a different principle. So if you do have a simple atom, let's say hydrogen, you've got a proton and a neutron and an electron traveling trillions of times a second in a timeless state, and that motion of a timeless state, no shell or no time shell around the atom, and then interference with the electron as it circles gives you a no shell sphere around the atom, makes it not interfere with the adjacent atoms because the adjacent atom has a no time shell around it. And then if we equate that down and consider the nucleus, what might be the difference between a proton and a neutron? How about the moving at the speed of time? If the proton is spinning at the speed of time, then it would be kicking off time waves also. They would just have a different characteristic than an object moving through space, leaving time waves behind, versus a proton spinning at the speed of time, throwing time waves out in every direction. So a proton with a single neutron or two neutrons would be a stable configuration. The neutron couldn't actually penetrate the no time zone that is wrapped around the proton, and if you ended up with more than two neutrons, then the gravitational attraction and the electron would make the system unstable. I think there's a reason why those things happen the way they do and why there's so much hydrogen, and I think it's related to the Big Bang, and that naturally you'd be able to put material in this configuration if you introduce time from the beginning. So we have a proton spinning at the speed of time, neutron sitting next to it, not able to penetrate that no time shell around the proton, and an electron making time waves in an orbit around that mass. So the orbitals that are in individual atoms also tie with this time wave concept. If you have two electrons in the first orbital, they can fit into a nice pattern of time waves and troughs, and they naturally probably fall into circling around the nucleus of the atom in a way that they don't interfere with each other too much. You introduce another electron, and that electron can't fit into that space that is occupied in the one orbital, so it has to set outside the time shell of the first two electrons and skims above it. At that point, you can now add additional electrons, and those electrons would interfere in a way that allows so many to occupy the next orbital, and then as you bumped another electron up, that electron would move to the next shell, and its time waves would cause it to float above the number 2 orbital, and so on and so forth. So as you filled an orbital, and because of each one being a little bigger, it can handle more electrons. Eventually, the turbulence caused by the time waves of the electrons would cause the additional electron to surf on top of the time waves of the orbitals below. This fits in, makes perfect sense with the time wave situation in the orbitals and the characteristics that we see in chemistry and that we know of the characteristics of an atom. So now that we have those concepts, we have an elliptical orbit, which gives us a Kepler effect, which is motion of the whole system once that elliptical orbit is introduced. We have that the electrons are producing time waves, and that those time waves affect things traveling at relativistic speeds. So as long as you're traveling at the speed of time, then a time wave affects you severely. As you drop out and move to more relative speeds, then time waves no longer affect you. So let's carry this idea to electromagnetism. So we know that a magnet is producing a force based on elliptical orbits and aligned atoms. Well, what do you think those aligned atoms might be doing in the substrate of the magnetic material? They're making standing time waves. In other words, they're pushing time through the magnet and causing a standing time wave that sits outside the magnet. And that is the standard line physics experiment with iron filings that shows the magnetic waves that form around the magnet. Well, those magnetic waves that form around a magnet are actually standing time waves produced by the aligned motion of the electrons and the aligned atoms in the magnetic structure. So the time waves are moving through the substrate and returning back to the other end. That is the reason that you can't have a single pole magnet, because the magnet is actually flowing time through the magnetic substrate. Now, I'm going to bring in another concept. I'm going to leave this one off other than to mention Maxwell's equations a little bit later. So we have a standing time wave that is magnetism, and then that magnetism produces electricity. Well, electricity is, once again, elliptical orbits in the copper conductor transferring down the conductor at the speed of light. So in other words, electricity is elliptical orbits that are induced in the copper matrix and pass down that copper wire at the speed of light, speed of time. That's the reason that a fixed time wave that's produced by a magnet, if you take a copper coil and move that copper coil up and down the magnet, those standing time waves will have an effect on the electrons in the matrix of the copper, and each one of those time waves will produce an elliptical orbit in those atoms, and that elliptical orbit is transferred down the conductor as electricity. Electricity has two characteristics. It has voltage and amperage. Well, voltage and amperage is the severity of the eclipse and the frequency with which the eclipse is transferred down the wire. So that is the voltage and amperage in electricity, is the size of the elliptical orbit and the speed with which the frequency that it travels down the wire. Obviously, this is an extremely good explanation of why and how that works that way, and it needs much more conversation. It will have to wait at another time. I may do additional videos and explain exactly how electricity works and why Maxwell's equations work the way they do. I'll touch on it slightly a little bit later, but so this gives us magnetism, gives us the method that magnetism can produce electricity. It gives us why electricity works the way it does. That is elliptical orbits, the motion produced by those elliptical orbits transferred down a wire to offer elliptical orbits in whatever it is the electricity is flowing into. So in other words, you take motion at one end, you transfer it into time waves, that time wave transfers it into elliptical motion in the conductors. That elliptical motion is transferred down the conductor, it's received on the other end, and those elliptical orbits are transferred to whatever the electric device on the other end is, and on the other end you get motion. And that motion is transferred from the original motion in the elliptical orbits of the battery or whatever it is providing the power. The generator that's using the magnetic force on the conductor to produce electricity. Magnetism is standing time waves, which is different than light, which is traveling time waves across time. Once again, time is full of space and space is full of time. Now, that is my general concept of unified theory. I will expand on it and discuss individual items, but I'm going to discuss a few equations now. And the first one is Schrodinger's equation. Well, Schrodinger's equation is a wave equation that's supposed to represent the energy of the particle. Well, it's broken down into two major groups, the kinetic energy and the potential energy. So these two items are more or less the potential of the speed at which it's running and the kinetic energy, which is the motion itself. The reason that this equation produces a probability is because it is a time-independent solution. I want to go back to the fact that an electron, when it's moving at the speed of time, it is not experiencing time. So an electron traveling at time speed is producing time waves, and it is also very severely affected by any time waves it encounters. And within the way this equation is arranged, there's no way that you're going to get anything but a probability out of this equation. And you should not expect anything but a probability. The idea that you take a particle and that is not experiencing time and you assign a time to it to actually give it a location, then it's no longer an electron. It's no longer traveling at the speed of time. So this equation cannot give you an absolute position of something that is not in an absolute position. It is moving in a timeless state. And that gives it specific characteristics that are tied to the fact that it is not experiencing time. this is an extremely important concept, and it's also extremely important to understand that quantum mechanics, the quantum or the unknown part of it is the fact that you're trying to measure something in a timeless state. The idea that it comes out in some unpredictable form or comes out as a probability is, by the nature of it being in a timeless state, you're trying to dictate it to fall out of that timeless state and assign a time to it. But this is the reason that the Schrodinger equation only leaves a probability. It's because what you're trying to describe is traveling in a timeless state, so a known position is not a characteristic it has. When you measure it, the wave collapses and the particle comes out. It's really tied to Einstein's missing variable. Einstein's equation is a centrifugal force equation. The missing variable is the denominator. The denominator represents the energy required to extract that electron from the orbit around the nucleus of the atom. Part of the reason that I think Einstein made this mistake is because he tried to measure the weight of an atom, and it did not match the constituent parts of the atom, and he assumed that energy was where that mass was going. It wasn't going into energy, it was going into the Kepler effect. In a gravitational field, an atom exerts, or the electron in an atom exerts a small force that counteracts gravity because the nucleus of the atom is drawn down, and that drawn down or gravitational influence causes the electron to begin to move in an ellipse, and that elliptical orbit causes a slight force. And that is the reason that an electron does not measure the same weight as the constituent parts. It's because it gets a little bit of elevated force from the elliptical orbit induced by the gravitational field it's sitting in. I think when you get to a black hole is actually matter without space and time. It does not go to a singularity. It goes to a singularity because the denominator goes to zero. Because the R goes to zero. So I really think a black hole is just matter without space and time. I think if you were to take matter, matter is busted into the size particle they are, the same way the sands on a beach are all the same size because of the forces that are exerted on the sand are the same thing that exerts force on matter. I think the size of an electron is due to the stress associated with going to the speed of time. And I think the size of a proton is dictated by the force associated with spinning at the speed of time. I think the Big Bang was for our galaxy, and that our time is expanding into an existing universe. The reason we can only see 14 billion light years is because that is as far as our time has traveled. And that is the only things that we can be aware of because of the paradox of time. I think if you take a look at the expansion, which actually can be complicated because there may be more sources that instigate to time, but that is the reason that it is proportional to distance. The farther you get away from us, the farther the space in between is expanding. So in other words, our space in existence is expanding at the speed of light, or the speed of time, at 14 billion light years, and the volume expanding at ground zero, where we are located, is 1/14 billionth per year. And that dictates that expansion. I think if you look at the existing galaxies, we have just not seen an explosion of a galaxy because the life cycles of galaxies are so utterly slow. So with this, the two-slot experiment is pretty straightforward. A particle traveling at time speed makes time waves. Those time waves affect that particle. You cannot measure a particle moving at time speed and get any reading without interfering with its speed and its position, because it's moving in a timeless state. You assign a time to it and the time wave collapses. And that's where the duality of material comes from. The reason you get an interference pattern on the two-slot is because the electrons are moved by those time waves and travel in the sweet spot of the individual time waves, and those time waves have an interference pattern that's associated with the fluid nature of time. This is the way the universe works. I'm interested in continuing my research. I'm not interested in hearing from people that will lose grant money. I'm only interested in hearing from people that understand what I'm talking about. And I don't think everyone will. But it is actually quite simple. There is only matter, motion, and time and space. God have mercy on our souls.